Resuming debate, the honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise in this House to speak in support of motion M-103. To start the debate, I want to be clear about what the motion says. That in the opinion of the House, the government should A, recognize the need to quell the increasing public climate of hate and fear, B, condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, and take note of House of Commons petition E411 and the issues raised by it, and C, request the Standing Committee on Canadian Heritage undertake a study on how the government could, 1, develop a whole-of-government approach to reducing or eliminating systemic racism and religious discrimination, including Islamophobia, in Canada, while ensuring a community-centered focus with a holistic response through evidence-based policy making, and 2, collect data to contextualize hate crime reports and to conduct needs assessment for impacted communities, and that the committee should present its findings and recommendations to the House no later than 240 calendar days from the adoption of this motion, provided that in its report the committee should make recommendations that the government may use to better reflect and enshrine rights and freedoms in the Constitution Acts, including the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Mr. Speaker, since the introduction of this motion in the House, it is most unfortunate that M-103 became controversial due to some intentionally misleading online campaigns. But instead of doing what is needed, I've been left even more disappointed and dismayed that the division and hate that fuels the misleading campaigns was brought right into this chamber with the politicking that took place between the Liberals and the Conservatives. I was even approached by a minister suggesting that M-103 would be nullified because the Conservatives had decided to put up a similar Opposition Day motion when, in fact, the information provided to the NDP from the clerk's office indicate otherwise. And frankly, that kind of fear-mongering and political gamesmanship served only to feed into the increasingly polarized climate surrounding this conversation instead of setting the example that is so desperately needed. To some, it may feel as though you score a cheap political point, but let's be clear, in the long run, it is all of us who want to stamp out discrimination driven by fear and division that will lose. So it is my hope that we can turn the page today and call on both the Liberals and Conservative members to set aside their partisan politics and unite with one voice on this motion. To begin, we have a duty and responsibility as members of Parliament to stand up to challenge the misinformation being spread around motion M-103 and to correct the record. Unlike what is claimed in the misinformation campaigns, M-103 in no way suppresses any rights of Canadians. The motion in no way favors one group over another or provides some additional benefit to one while taking away from another. It states quite clearly in the motion that government should, quote, condemn Islamophobia and all forms of systemic racism and religious discrimination, end quote. The suggestion that the motion somehow excludes other forms of discrimination is simply false. As well, the fear that this motion would somehow restrict people's freedom of speech is also unfounded. Nowhere does it state in the motion that people could not inquire or have opinions about the Islamic faith. In fact, on the contrary, it's been my experience that those who practice the Islamic faith are very open and welcoming to those who do not practice or know or understand their faith. I, for one, know very little about the Islamic faith, and in my capacity as the NDP critic for immigration, refugees, and citizenship, I've had the privilege of being invited by many people who practice the Islamic faith and to attend events at mosques as a means to learn and understand their religious teachings and culture. They are open and they welcome questions. They even welcome criticisms. They patiently answer all my inquiries. They were more than welcoming when it is my strongest belief, Mr. Speaker, that through such interactions that we as members of our community, that we are building bridges between communities. We're actively practicing the promotion of cross-cultural understanding. We are fully embracing and respecting our differences. And in that process, Mr. Speaker, we're breaking down walls of fear and walls of division. I have no doubt that I am not the only one who have experienced this. I know that many of my other colleagues have had similar exchanges. So it is my hope that we let such example be the guiding force, our compass, as we build to strengthen our bond between communities. And if we witness the opposite, such as the horrific mosque attack that occurred in Quebec City, then we as parliamentarians from all sides of the House must unite to condemn such despicable actions. And I'm proud that we did exactly that. There is no question that we have a duty as members of Parliament to set an example and to speak out against all forms of discrimination and hate wherever we see it. If we are to hold true to those principles, then we must be consistent with our efforts. That is to say, we need to call out discrimination wherever we see it, at home and abroad. Just today, it was reported in the news that a Pan-American Commission will hold an emergency hearing in Washington to investigate the impact of Trump's executive orders on human rights in the country. The Inter-American Commission on Human Rights was requested by advocacy groups in both Canada and the U.S. to review, quote, ongoing and deteriorating, end quote, conditions faced by asylum seekers and other migrants under the Trump administration. They're asking the Commission to make findings that Trump's travel ban against 6 Muslim-majority countries and his expansion of detention and deportation against migrants violate U.S. rights obligations. To quote Alfred Arbel, a UBC law professor who co-authored with the Harvard Immigration and Refugee Clinic program a report on Trump's executive orders, he said, the expedited removals and expansion of detention under the orders are going to have profound implications on the U.S. asylum system, end quote. As we witness President Trump, our neighbor, our closest ally, fan fear and hate against members of the Muslim community with his executive orders and immigration policies, how is it that somehow acceptable for our own Prime Minister and Minister of Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship has chosen to be willfully blind to this blatant act of discrimination and do nothing about it? This is so distressing to me, Mr. Chair. In fact, not only is the Canadian government silent about Trump's discriminatory policies, the Minister of Immigration would go as far as to say that nothing has changed. This, of course, is blatantly false, and everyone knows it. I dare say perhaps even the minister knows it. The question is, will he summon enough courage to speak up and speak out against Trump's racist policies? So far, he hasn't. Perhaps the minister could meet some of the young people that I had recently encountered at a rally at the Peace Arch Crossing. It was a rally against Trump's racist executive orders, and in the crowd, a young person held up a sign that said, quote, if you build a wall, my generation will break it down, end quote. Another sign said, quote, make racism wrong again, end quote. Mr. Speaker, I can't tell you how encouraged I was to see the young people's activism. Their strong and direct message is what gives me hope that our collective future is possible. Mr. Speaker, bringing their voices and concerns to the House of Commons is a true privilege and one that I take very seriously. New Democrats will stand proudly with these young people to combat the politics of hate and division. The NDP is in favor of any motion that aims to address and combat discrimination, and we will not wallow in political games on these critical issues, especially in the face of raising hate crimes against the Muslim community. It is the opinion of the NDP and myself that this motion and the work to be undertaken by a committee that is entirely appropriate and should be welcomed by all parliamentarians. As such, the NDP has no hesitation in supporting this motion. As elected officials and representatives of our community in the House of Commons, I firmly believe that we have a duty to stand up together against Islamophobia, racism, and discrimination of all forms. Let's get together and do this right. On this very day, we're to honor International Day against racism. Let's all support this motion, Mr. Speaker.
Reprise du débat, l'honorable
Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.